Las Vegas had always promised excess, risk, and the illusion that a man could lose himself for one night and still return whole by morning, but for Nick, the city had become something far more vicious. It was no longer a playground of bright lights and dangerous impulses. It had become a trap built with cold patience, a place designed to strip him down to the weakest, ugliest version of himself and make him stare at that reflection until it broke him. When consciousness finally returned, it did not come gently. It hit in fragments of pain, pressure, and suffocating darkness. His head pounded with a brutal rhythm that made it hard to think, hard to breathe, hard to separate memory from panic. He felt the bite of restraints cutting into his wrists behind his back before he fully understood where he was. The floor beneath him was hard, the air stale, the silence thick enough to feel staged. Then came the deeper horror, the realization that this was not merely captivity. This was performance. There was a faint mechanical hum somewhere above him, and when Nick forced himself to lift his head despite the nausea clawing at his gut, he saw the tiny red light of a camera watching him from the corner like an unblinking eye. That was the moment the truth sank in with full cruelty. He was not just tied up in some forgotten room. He was being displayed. Someone was watching him unravel in real time, and Matt had arranged every second of it. By the time Matt emerged from the shadows, the room had already done part of his work for him. Fear had begun its slow poison in Nick's blood, mixing with the physical aftershock of the ambush and the dangerous instability Matt had clearly counted on. There was no theatrical gloating at first, no need for it. Matt carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent too long nursing humiliation and had finally found the perfect stage for revenge. He did not need to shout because control itself had become his weapon. He moved through that dim room, like its architect, calm where Nick was disoriented, collected where Nick's body was beginning to betray him. And when he finally made it clear that the camera was transmitting everything to a mysterious observer, the humiliation deepened into something even more corrosive. Nick had spent his life trying to hold himself together for the people around him, trying to remain the stable one in a family built on pressure, ego, and emotional landmines. Now he was being forced to come apart for an unseen audience, reduced from man to spectacle, from target to experiment. Matt was not simply punishing him. He was documenting the collapse. The cruelty of the setup became even sharper when Matt revealed that death was not his immediate goal. Killing Nick would have been simple, almost merciful compared to what Matt actually wanted. He wanted degradation. He wanted submission. He wanted to take the weakness Nick feared most and shove him straight back into it until there was nothing left of his pride, his will, or his identity. Matt had no interest in revenge that ended quickly. He wanted to hollow Nick out from the inside and turn him into a puppet, someone so desperate, chemically broken, and mentally shattered that he could be led, displayed, and used. The idea was not merely to make Nick relapse. It was to force him to do it under pressure, under surveillance, in full knowledge that someone else was watching him sink. It was a grotesque act of domination, disguised as payback. Matt understood that physical pain fades, but shame can be made permanent. He wanted Nick alive precisely because a living man could still be bent. That was where the true psychological war began. Nick had been carrying strain long before the kidnapping, strain he had hidden even from people who loved him. Vegas had already sharpened his impulses, exposed old vulnerabilities, and blurred the line between control and collapse. Matt knew that. He had studied that weakness, waited for it, perhaps even helped cultivate it. The revelation struck Nick with sickening force. This was not random timing. This was not just a criminal settling a score. Matt had built his attack around the worst chapter of Nick's recent spiral because he knew addiction is not simply about craving. It is about shame, denial, rage, and the terrible fear that one bad night can erase every promise a man made to himself. Matt wanted to drag Nick back into that hell and make him complicit in his own destruction. The trap was vicious, precisely because it forced Nick to fight not only his captor, but also his own body, his own impulses, and his own guilt. Then came the betrayal. Matt did not present it as a dramatic twist. He presented it as proof, as one more calculated incision meant to sever whatever emotional stability Nick had left. There was evidence, enough to feel undeniable in the moment, that someone close to Nick had exposed his location. Matt offered just enough detail to poison trust, but not enough to bring certainty. That was the genius of it. A full answer would have given Nick something clear to hate. Ambiguity gave him something worse. It turned his mind against everyone. A message, a timestamp, a location leak. The suggestion that this ambush had only been possible because somebody inside his circle had betrayed him. In that instant, the room seemed to contract around him. Nick had lived through family conflict, corporate warfare, romantic betrayal, and the endless, exhausting politics of loyalty. But this cut deeper because he was already vulnerable. To hear that someone close had pointed Matt in his direction while he was already fighting to stay upright was almost more than he could absorb. Rage surged through him, but it was tangled with disbelief. His first instinct was denial, then suspicion, then a terrible flicker of self-reproach. Had his chaos pushed someone away? Had his recent spiral made him reckless enough to trust the wrong person? Or was this simply another of Matt's manipulations, designed to turn his family against itself before the physical battle had even begun? Outside that room, the emotional fallout was building just as fast. Adam was the first to feel the full weight of disaster because he understood immediately that failure in Vegas never stayed contained. Once Matt had Nick, the situation was no longer a rescue problem. It was a chain reaction. Adam had promised himself that he would not let Nick go under. Not this time. Not when he had already seen too many people in their orbit dragged to the edge and left there bleeding. But Adam's anxiety was inseparable from guilt. He knew better than most what manipulation looked like because he had spent so much of his own life living inside it. He could see how easily a desperate man could be maneuvered, how pride could become a blindfold, how fear could make the wrong decision seem like the only one. The possibility that Nick had walked into a trap while Adam remained one step behind filled him with a fury he could barely contain. Yet beneath that fury was a quieter, more humiliating truth. He also feared that he had once again underestimated how far an enemy was willing to go. For a man who prided himself on reading danger, that failure felt personal. Adam's inner conflict sharpened when the implications of Matt's deeper plan began to emerge. If Nick had been kept alive, then he was bait. That meant Matt was not finished. That meant the kidnapping was only one move in a larger strategy designed to draw another target into the open. Adam knew the obvious possibility immediately, and the thought landed like a blade to the ribs. Matt might be using Nick to lure him. The very idea poisoned every instinct he had. If he charged in too recklessly, he could play directly into Matt's hands and get them both killed. If he hesitated, Nick might not survive the weight. Adam was left in the kind of torment that destroys men from the inside, the knowledge that action could be fatal and inaction could be unforgivable. It forced him into the familiar nightmare of being both protector and liability at once. Every second Nick spent in captivity made Adam angrier, but that anger had no clean direction because it was also laced with blame. He blamed Matt for the cruelty, Nick for his recklessness, whoever had leaked the information for their treachery, and himself for not shutting this down before it escalated beyond control. Chelsea's dread, meanwhile, came from a different place, but hit with equal force. Where Adam saw tactics and consequences, Chelsea felt patterns. Something about Vegas had been wrong from the start, wrong in the way danger often announces itself not with evidence but with atmosphere, with the eerie sense that every choice is sliding toward a cliff edge. Her fear was not abstract. It was intimate, visceral, deeply human. She knew what it looked like when men convinced themselves they still had control long after they had lost it. She knew what happens when desperation starts masquerading as confidence. And once she understood that Nick was missing and Adam was spiraling into rescue mode, standing still became impossible. Chelsea's determination was not about heroics. It was about refusing to remain the helpless bystander to another disaster she had sensed coming. Yet even that resolve carried its own conflict. Going to Vegas meant plunging into a war zone of secrets, addiction, family tension, and emotional volatility. It meant putting herself in the direct path of something brutal. Still, staying behind would have meant living with the possibility that fear had once again made her passive. Chelsea could endure danger more easily than helplessness. Sharon's decision to involve herself carried layers of pain and instinct that reached even deeper. Her life had taught her how quickly unresolved chaos can consume an entire family, and Nick's suffering had always had a way of awakening both tenderness and terror in her. She knew his strength, but she also knew his fractures, the places where pressure and guilt could crack him open. The possibility that someone was not only hurting him but using his addiction as a weapon was intolerable. Sharon was not driven merely by concern. She was driven by protective fury, the kind born from years of watching the people she loved become targets in power games they never fully chose. Yet her desire to help also forced her to confront a painful truth. She could not save Nick by loving him, and perhaps she never could. That recognition did not weaken her determination. It made it sharper, sadder, more disciplined. She would go because doing nothing was impossible, but she would go knowing that emotional history could cloud judgment just as effectively as fear. Noah's involvement added another combustible layer. He might tell himself he was going for Sharon, that his priority was protecting her from stepping into danger unguarded, but beneath that was something more volatile. Vegas had already become a symbol of everything unstable and toxic circling the Newman family, and Matt represented the ugliest expression of that instability. Noah's urge to step in came from loyalty, but loyalty in that family often blurred into inherited recklessness. He could feel the pull of confrontation, the seductive simplicity of finding the man responsible and ending the threat by force if necessary. That impulse made him dangerous, because rage can feel righteous while still serving the enemy's design. If Matt wanted the Newmans emotional, divided, and charging in from different directions, Noah's anger could become another opening. Yet his presence also threatened Matt's sense of control. The more people converged on Vegas, the harder it became for Matt to keep managing the narrative he had built. That was why every new ally was both a hope and a risk. Sienna's likely role in the widening conflict carried its own tension because her motives would never be read as cleanly as anyone else's. Her willingness to stand against Matt could come from principle, from loyalty, from self-interest, or from some complex mixture of all three. In an atmosphere already poisoned by betrayal, nobody could afford to trust too easily. And that uncertainty echoed the deeper emotional theme devouring everyone around Nick. Trust itself had become unstable. Every alliance now came with suspicion attached. Every act of help invited questions about timing, motive, and cost. Matt had succeeded in more than one way already, because even before the final confrontation, he had infected the people chasing him with doubt. That kind of damage lasts. It lingers even after bruises fade and doors are kicked in. Back inside the locked room, the physical battle had shifted from dread to endurance. Nick's body had begun turning against him in earnest. The forced stress, the chemical cravings lurking just beneath his skin, the ache in his muscles, and the humiliation of being observed were pushing him toward the edge. Matt wanted him to cross. He began to shake, first subtly, then violently enough that even Matt seemed to relish it. What should have been private suffering was now part of the show, but Matt's mistake was believing that visible collapse meant surrender. In reality, desperation stripped Nick down to instinct. Once panic burned through its first wave, something harder began to surface underneath. Rage. Not the theatrical kind, not the blind kind, but the cold, survival-driven fury of a man who realizes he is being kept alive not out of mercy but because someone wants ownership over him. That realization transformed the humiliation. It gave it direction. Nick started to observe. The camera angle, the distance between Matt and the door, the timing of his movements, the smug certainty that made him slower in the crucial moments. Even through the physical torment, Nick recognized the smallest fracture in Matt's control: arrogance. Matt believed he had already won because he had succeeded in bringing Nick low. He mistook suffering for defeat. So when Nick's body convulsed and his breathing turned ragged, Matt leaned too close, too certain that he was simply watching the next phase of psychological submission unfold. For a few vital seconds, Matt's attention narrowed. He saw weakness where there was still will. Nick used those seconds with the kind of raw, reckless force only a cornered man can access. He surged, twisted, slammed his weight, anything to break the rhythm Matt had scripted for him. It was not elegant. It was not controlled. It was survival in its ugliest form. A wounded man hurling himself against the machinery of his own destruction. The attempt failed, but failure did not make it meaningless. Nick discovered almost immediately that the room had been engineered against improvisation. The door was locked with an electronic system, Another sign that Matt had anticipated desperation and built layers around it. There would be no simple rush to freedom, no lucky break, no conveniently flawed trap. Every route out had been considered, protected, denied. Yet the failed attempt did something else, something Matt could not fully undo. It changed the energy in the room. Nick was no longer merely enduring, he was resisting. That resistance was enough to disturb the neat emotional image Matt wanted to transmit to his hidden observer. A broken puppet does not fight with that much fury. A doomed man does not look at the camera the way Nick began to look at it now, not with shame, but with the dawning resolve of someone who would rather die fighting than be reshaped into another man's weapon. Then Matt made the choice that revealed his deeper insecurity. He explained more than he needed to. Men drunk on control often do. He made it clear that Nick's life was being preserved because someone important still had to be drawn in. Whether that target was Adam, Sharon, or someone else tied to Nick's emotional core hardly mattered in the moment. The point was clear enough. Nick was not the endgame, he was the lure. Matt wanted the rescue attempt. He wanted someone desperate enough to walk straight into the maze he had built. That confession was chilling not just because it proved Matt's ambitions were broader, but because it showed how personal the game had become. Matt did not want a single victim. He wanted a chain of collapses, a domino line of emotional ruin. He wanted to expose love itself as a weakness, to prove that anyone who came for Nick could be trapped through him. That was the point when Nick's anger shed its last traces of panic and became purpose. Pain was still there. The cravings were still there. The betrayal still gnawed at him, and the uncertainty over who had sold him out cut like acid through every memory of recent trust. But now those feelings were no longer simply overwhelming him. They were aligning. His mind, though battered, began assembling the truth in a harsher but clearer shape. Matt needed him alive because Matt was not as invincible as he pretended. A man who truly held all the power would not need bait. A man who truly believed in his dominance would not need an audience. The camera, the live stream, the taunting, the weaponized relapse, the half-revealed betrayal, all of it pointed to the same hidden weakness. Matt needed validation as much as revenge. He needed someone to witness Nick's fall, because without a witness, his power would feel incomplete. That hunger made him dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. And then, just when the room had settled into its new, unstable balance, a sound came from outside the door. It was small at first, metallic, almost ambiguous enough to be imagined. Then it came again, undeniable, the signal of movement in the corridor beyond. In another situation it might have brought relief, but here it only deepened the terror. Rescue or reinforcements. Hope or a second wave of entrapment. Matt's face changed in an instant, and that shift was perhaps the most revealing thing Nick had seen all night. For the first time, Matt looked uncertain. Only slightly. Only for a flash, but enough. Whatever was happening outside had not unfolded exactly on schedule. Nick saw it and understood. The balance was changing again. In that suspended moment, every emotional thread tightened at once. Somewhere beyond that electronic lock, the people converging on Vegas were moving closer to the center of the storm, each carrying their own fear, guilt, and determination. Adam with his self-reproach and ferocious need to make this right. Chelsea with the terrible certainty that instinct had been warning her all along, sharing with the kind of love that hurts because it cannot stay passive. Noah with his volatile loyalty. Perhaps even Sienna, entering a battlefield where motives would be judged as harshly as actions. And inside the room, Nick lifted his head toward the camera one more time. The man staring into that lens was not calm, not healed, not remotely safe. He was still bound, still shaking, still trapped in a room designed to turn him into evidence of his own weakness. But the fear in his face had changed. It had hardened into something more dangerous. What looked back through that camera now was not surrender, not humiliation, not the vacant collapse Matt had promised his invisible watcher. It was defiance sharpened by pain, the expression of a man who had been pushed so far into the dark that survival no longer felt separate from revenge. And as the sound outside the door grew louder and the uncertainty thickened into the promise of violence, Nick's eyes made one thing brutally clear. He was done waiting to be saved. If the next move demanded blood, sacrifice, or the destruction of whatever remained of the man Vegas had tried to break, then he was prepared to answer with something just as ruthless.